I'm going to be presenting my project, which seeks to answer the question of what is the role of Chinese state-owned enterprises and recipient governments in the development and execution of Chinese cross-border infrastructure projects. So briefly, some background. So in 2013, China launched its Belt and Road Initiative, which has become the umbrella for all of China's cross-border infrastructure projects, and it has become a key component of China's foreign policy, as it is the pet project of current Chinese President Xi Jinping. Other states, particularly in the West, have political concern regarding what China's intentions are with the Belt and Road Initiative, whether they're trying to meet any strategic goals, and there's also the concern about debt trap diplomacy, which is the idea that that China is saddling other countries with bad or unsustainable loans or debt in order to extract influence from those countries. And so the purpose of my project and the goal that I set for myself is to better understand the internal dynamics of the BRI. So to understand whether or not these projects are really a grand strategy or whether or not they're more of an ad hoc initiative. And so the way I go about doing that is by examining the roles of SOEs and recipient countries in the project. And so briefly, to just touch on the literature review, my argument stands on top of two debates that are ongoing right now, which is one is what is China's role in its infrastructure projects and its cross-border infrastructure projects. The common thinking is that China is developing and proposing these projects as a kind of a unilateral actor where they're strategically designed. However, the more recent school of thought is that China is more of a financier, where recipient governments and SOEs play a really strong and powerful role in that they are the ones to promote and propose projects where it's the job of China to choose which to finance. The second debate is about China SOE relations, since I'm getting at the roles of SOEs. The common thinking is that SOEs as arms of the state will automatically seek national interests. Two other schools of thought posit that SOEs are more independent actors that are seeking their own profit, whereas a third school of thought proposes that China and SOEs act kind of like a principal-agent relationship, where China is the principal and it's enabling its agent, the SOEs, to act on its behalf for its foreign economic policy. And so in this case, China's interest and SOE's interest may conflict or align. And so in building my argument, I argue that it's kind of it's a combination of China as a financier from the first debate, and then the principal-agent relationship between SOEs and China in the second debate. And so I posit my thesis as SOEs and recipient governments are both powerful actors in China's infrastructure projects that seek to maximize their own interests. And to address my question and potentially support or refute my thesis, I did a case study between two China-funded projects. The first is the Gwadar Port in Pakistan, and the second is the Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. I selected the Hambantota Port specifically because it's the primary case study for the debt trap diplomacy argument. And so my goal with these two cases is to examine what role the recipient governments and relevant SOEs play with respect to each project. And so to go briefly over some of my notable findings. First, for SOE behavior, in the Gwadar Port case, I found that the current port operator is a Chinese SOE that was created specifically to operate the Gwadar Port. They have never operated a port before, and they were created just before China obtained the lease, or this company obtained the lease for the Gwadar Port. So I argue that this is a way for China to keep a very short leash on the SOE that's currently operating the port. On the Hambantota Port side, the SOE that is responsible for constructing the port lobbied both the Sri Lankan government as well as the Chinese government and utilized its connections in both Sri Lanka and in China in order to promote the project and have it proposed. It was also accused and found to have inflated the project proposal and costs, having misrepresented those to both the Chinese government as well as Sri Lanka. And so in this case, I argue that the SOE is acting mostly independently on its own profit-seeking basis. As for notable recipient government behavior, I find very similar things between both the Hambantota Port case and the Gwadar Port case. On the Gwadar Port, on both cases, I find that the projects are proposed mostly by the recipient governments. Only in the Hambantota Port case was there any lobbying or involvement from any Chinese actor. In that case, it was a Chinese SOE. But in both cases, they use the ports to respond to some domestic needs. So in the Gwadar Port case, most politicians point to overburdened ports. In the Hambantota Port case, they usually point to underdevelopment in the southern regions. And so I argue that SOEs overall are opportunistic profit seekers, sometimes profiteering to inflate project costs, and sometimes they'll act as arms of the state. And then on the recipient government side, they usually will promote the projects or propose the projects, and often in response to some domestic need. And so my implication here is that the recipients have legitimate development needs, and they're searching for some country to fund it, and China is simply filling that gap. China, at least from what I see, is not forcing unprofitable projects, but I would explain those unsustainable projects more through SOE profiteering and domestic conditions of recipients, such as domestic economic turmoil leading to unsustainable projects, rather than that being the strategic design of China from the beginning. And then third is that the BRI and China's cross-border infrastructure projects mostly look like a mix of strategy and ad hoc arrangements where recipient countries have a strong control over what projects are actually executed or funded by China, as well as SOEs are often acting independent of the Chinese state in how they handle and execute these projects.